Aisha Coleman stood under the dim yellow lights of the parking lot, her fingers curled tightly around the strap of her purse. It was nearly 7 o'clock in the evening, and the last soft hues of daylight were dissolving into the gray of Atlanta's summer dusk. She had driven straight from Jefferson Middle School, still wearing her navy blue slacks and the rust-orange blouse with the modest ruffle that her students always complimented. Her day had been long. 2 parent meetings, an unexpected fire drill, and a pile of quizzes that still needed grading. All she wanted was to get in and out quickly. Rice, onions, maybe some broccoli. 15 minutes tops, she told herself as she pushed open the glass doors of the store. The automatic sensor beeped softly as she entered. The supermarket wasn't busy, just a few scattered shoppers moving quietly through the aisles. A child laughed somewhere near the dairy section. The speakers hummed low with an old rhythm and blues tune that sounded like something from her mother's record player. She grabbed a red basket from the stack and made her way to the produce section, the wheels of her tired thoughts beginning to turn toward dinner. But as she reached for a bundle of scallions, she caught a glimpse, reflected faintly in the glass of the refrigerator door, of a man in uniform standing near the entrance. Tall, bald, with a thick build, wearing a dark blue security vest. He was watching her. Aisha glanced away immediately. Maybe he looked at everyone, she thought. Maybe he wasn't even looking at her. She moved on, pretending not to notice, her fingers grazing the apples and then slipping down to inspect the limes. But after picking 2 and placing them in her basket, she noticed him again, this time pretending to arrange a row of carts near the floral section. It was subtle, almost clumsy in how deliberate it was. She exhaled through her nose and pressed her lips together. She had learned too many times how these things played out, the silent scrutiny, the unspoken suspicion, the lingering presence that would not identify itself as aggressive but would still worm its way into her skin. She walked slowly toward the canned goods, telling herself not to overreact. But he followed, always just a few aisles behind, never close enough to be blatant, never far enough to ignore. She paused near the soup aisle, pretending to examine a label, and stole a glance over her shoulder. There he was, standing at the corner by the condiments, his posture half relaxed, half alert, like a dog waiting for a signal. Aisha's pulse climbed a notch. It wasn't the first time she had felt this. She had felt it at department stores, at gas stations, once even at a bookstore downtown. The slow, gnawing suggestion that her presence was somehow out of place, that her being there, being black, was grounds for scrutiny. She moved on, to the pasta aisle, then to the household goods. Each step she took, she could feel him trailing behind. He wasn't trying to be invisible. He wanted her to know he was there. The psychology of it was unmistakable. A calculated presence, designed to unsettle. A young couple passed her near the paper towels, their cart full and their voices easy with conversation. They gave her a polite nod. The woman's gaze flicked briefly toward the security guard before sliding away again. She had noticed, too. She just chose not to see it. Aisha stopped in front of a shelf of glass cleaners. Her hand hovered, then withdrew. She wasn't even sure what she was pretending to consider anymore. Her mind was elsewhere now. Not on the groceries. Not on the food she had come to prepare, but on the familiarity of this script. The absurd, exhausting choreography of being watched. She closed her eyes for a moment and inhaled. The store felt colder than it had 10 minutes ago. The music, once nostalgic, now buzzed in her ears like static. Every footstep echoed sharper. Every cartwheel felt like a needle dragging across tile. She placed the cleaner back and turned, walking briskly toward the rice section. She wasn't ready to confront. Not yet, but she wasn't going to let this pass unacknowledged either. As she passed the freezer section, she brushed her hand across the inside pocket of her jacket. Her phone was still there, angled slightly upward, camera quietly recording. She had turned it on sometime after her third aisle, instinctively, just as she had trained herself to do in any situation that teetered toward escalation. It wasn't about paranoia. It was about evidence. She reached the rice and paused, selecting a simple long grain brand, and added it to her basket. Nothing flashy. Nothing that could be used later to suggest she had been behaving suspiciously or lingering without intent to buy. Everything methodical, purposeful, clean, The footsteps were there again, closer now. She walked in front of the store, basket swinging lightly in her hand. Her shoulders were high, her gaze fixed forward. She didn't need to see him behind her. She felt the air shift every time he moved. When she reached the registers, she noted that only one lane was open, manned by a woman in her late 40s with short, clipped hair and a name tag that read Pamela. The manager was nearby, too, perched like a hawk near customer service, flipping through a clipboard but glancing at her every few seconds. His tie was crooked. His hair was neatly parted. His face was set in that neutral expression that said everything and nothing at once. Aisha placed the rice and a single bottle of dish soap on the conveyor belt. Pamela gave her a half smile. "Evening." Aisha nodded, but her eyes didn't leave the clipboard in the manager's hand. Behind her, she could feel the security guard stop just short of the checkout lane, standing close enough to monitor but far enough to deny. That was when the idea solidified. Quiet but certain. She set her purse on the counter and unzipped it slowly, her fingers wrapping around the envelope she had placed there 3 days earlier. Not an accident. Not a coincidence. Something she had started carrying weeks ago, after another incident in another store where she had been followed but left without proof. She laid the envelope gently on the counter, just as Pamela reached for the rice. "Before we do this," Aisha said, her voice low but unmistakably clear, "I need your manager to read this." Pamela blinked, hesitated, then glanced over her shoulder. The manager looked up. Aisha lifted her hand and pointed to the envelope. "Please, read it, out loud if you need to." The air in the checkout lane shifted. The humming fluorescent lights above seemed to quiet. Aisha stood still, her face composed, her hands folded calmly in front of her. Behind her, the security guard moved forward, just half a step. The manager stepped in uncertain and reached for the envelope, and as his fingers slid under the flap, Aisha knew the balance of the moment had tilted. The tension that had been quietly building since she entered the store had finally found its hinge. She did not blink. She did not move. The room waited. The rustle of paper as the envelope was opened sounded louder than it should have, like the room itself had fallen silent to listen. Aisha stood still, her eyes locked on the manager's face as he slid the contents out, unfolded the letter, and began to read. At first, his brows furrowed in confusion, as though he couldn't quite make sense of what he was seeing. But then, gradually, his expression changed. The corners of his mouth stiffened. His eyes darted briefly toward Aisha, then to the security guard still lingering just feet away. His fingers tightened around the paper. Aisha didn't move. She had delivered the moment. Now she would let it unfold. Pamela, the cashier, stood frozen, one hand still resting lightly on the rice bag. She glanced between Aisha and the manager, her face taut with awkwardness, unsure if she should continue scanning or step back altogether. The line behind Aisha was beginning to form. Two people, a young woman with headphones and a man in a polo shirt, both of whom started to sense the unusual tension, but said nothing. The music had faded to background noise. Every sound in the store now felt more distinct. The beeping of a scanner 3 aisles over. The distant hum of an overhead announcement. A low call from someone near the freezer section. The manager lowered the paper slowly, his lips parting as if to speak. But no words came immediately. He looked again at the letter, then at Aisha. "Ma'am," he began, hesitating. "I'm not sure what." Aisha cut in gently, her tone even but unwavering. "You read it. You know exactly what it is. And you know why I'm standing here right now." He swallowed hard. The security guard, sensing the shift, took another step forward as though he might intervene, but stopped short when Aisha turned her head just slightly toward him. She didn't speak to him. She didn't need to. The unspoken accusation hung in the air, too vivid now to ignore. "I didn't authorize any," the manager began again, but Aisha tilted her head. "You didn't need to," she said. "You hire people who act on assumptions. You create a space where this behavior feels normal. That's your signature at the bottom, whether you admit it or not." He stared at her, and for the first time since she had entered the store, there was something approaching fear behind his eyes. Not the fear of violence or confrontation, but the fear of exposure, of consequence. The man in the polo shirt behind her stepped out of line and walked away quietly, clearly wanting no part in what he was witnessing. The young woman with headphones took one earbud out and leaned slightly to the side, trying to understand what was going on without appearing too curious. Pamela looked down at the letter, now resting on the counter beside the groceries. She read a few lines quickly, and her lips pressed into a thin line. Then she turned to the manager, her voice low but clear. "You want me to finish ringing her up, or—" He said nothing. Aisha could feel the seconds dragging out, each one stretched tight with the weight of implication. She didn't enjoy this. It wasn't vindictive. It was necessary. She had grown tired of the silent apologies. The "ma'am, we didn't mean anything by it" speeches. The denial camouflaged as diplomacy. This wasn't about ego. It was about truth. Behind the scenes, she knew her phone was still recording. Video and audio. A continuous documentation of the sequence of events. The expression on the manager's face. The proximity of the security guard. The shift in body language from denial to discomfort. All of it captured. She turned her attention back to Pamela. "Please go ahead," she said softly. "I have somewhere to be." Pamela scanned the rice and the detergent in silence. The beep of the scanner punctuated the moment like a gavel. Aisha inserted her card, typed her code, and waited. "Would you like a bag?" Pamela asked. "No, thank you." She placed both items back into her basket, picked it up, and then looked one final time at the manager. "I didn't come here to make a scene," she said. "But scenes happen when people refuse to see what's right in front of them." The manager opened his mouth again, probably to apologize, some safe, sterile variation of it. But Aisha turned before he could speak. She walked past the security guard, who still hadn't moved, and for the briefest second, she looked him in the eye. Not with hatred, not even with anger, just with a clarity that seemed to stop him from saying anything at all. As she passed through the sliding doors, the air outside felt warmer than it had when she arrived. The night had settled in, and the parking lot lights cast long shadows on the asphalt. She walked to her car without rushing, placing her basket in the passenger seat and sitting for a long moment before turning the engine. Inside, the dashboard lights illuminated her face. Calm, centered, and resolute. She didn't drive home immediately. Instead, she pulled into a nearby parking lot, unlocked her phone, and reviewed the footage. Every frame was clear. Every word, every gesture, every hesitation documented with precision. She uploaded the video to her cloud, typed out a brief caption, and shared it to her social platforms. Not with fury, but with purpose. Within minutes, the notifications began. Comments, messages, shares. The story was beginning to spread. But that, Aisha knew, was only the surface. The deeper impact, the one that mattered, was what would come next. Not the temporary wave of online outrage, but the way this moment would ripple through the community. The way that store, that manager, that guard would be forced to re-examine the silent culture they had nurtured. Aisha didn't need retribution. She needed change. And change, she had learned, never came politely. Aisha drove with both hands firm on the wheel, the weight of the moment slowly dissolving into the stillness of her car. The streetlights glided past her windshield like silent witnesses, illuminating her composed face with flickers of pale light. The rice and detergent rested quietly in the passenger seat, as mundane as ever, but now emblematic of something far larger than dinner plans. She didn't turn the radio on. The hum of the tires against the road was enough. Her mind, however, was far from silent. By the time she reached her apartment complex, the video had already been shared over 100 times. She noticed it in the brief moment she checked her phone before stepping out of the car. No dramatic music, no added commentary, just raw footage of her standing at that register, placing the envelope on the counter, and letting the truth unfold. The clarity of it was its own statement. She didn't go straight inside. Instead, she stood for a moment in the cool night air, letting her body release the last of the tension. Her posture remained upright, her presence unshaken, but inside she was measuring the ripple effects. This wasn't the first time she had been followed in a store, but it was the first time she had come prepared to dismantle the pattern rather than escape it. Aisha stepped into her apartment and placed the bag gently on the kitchen counter. The clock read 8:30. She didn't start cooking. Instead, she walked to her small office at the end of the hallway, opened her laptop, and connected it to the cloud folder where the video had been saved. She knew how people would react. Some would call her brave. Others would accuse her of seeking attention. There would be voices trying to reduce her experience to a misunderstanding or a misinterpretation. But that was why the letter, the envelope, the recording, it had all been deliberate. This was an emotional outburst. It was strategy. She opened an old folder in her hard drive labeled Precedents. Inside were documents, legal briefs, witness statements, and video evidence from previous incidents she had faced. Incidents she had turned into formal legal complaints. Names redacted, faces blurred. But the patterns were unmistakable. And with every document, she had built not just a case for herself, but a foundation for challenging these quiet assaults that occurred in plain sight. Her phone buzzed again. A message from her friend Nia. "Girl, I just saw your video. I'm speechless." Aisha typed back, "That was a goal." She didn't need congratulations. What she needed now was clarity about the next move. The letter the manager had read wasn't just a warning. It was a declaration of intent, drafted with help from a friend who worked at a reputable Atlanta law firm. It was designed to freeze the moment, make those responsible pause before speaking, and remind them that silence could be as damaging as any spoken word. Now that the video was public, the next decision had to be precise. There was no need to escalate prematurely. Legal action was always a possibility, but for now, it was leverage. She sent an email to the firm. Subject line, "New incident, surveillance," and letter enacted. She attached a video link and added a brief paragraph summarizing the sequence of events. Within 20 minutes, her contact replied, "Received. Let's talk tomorrow. You've executed this flawlessly." Aisha leaned back in her chair. It wasn't satisfaction she felt. It was vindication, subtle, controlled, and earned. But more than that, it was the validation of her instincts. She had anticipated this, had rehearsed it mentally countless times. Every word she said at the checkout, every step leading up to it, none of it had been spontaneous. The next morning, she awoke to a flood of notifications. The video had surpassed 10,000 views overnight. Her inbox was full. Some messages from people thanking her for speaking up. Others sharing their own stories of being watched followed, treated like intruders in places where they were merely shopping. There were media requests too, mostly from local journalists who had picked up on the virality of the footage. But Aisha wasn't interested in spectacle. She replied to only one of them, an independent black-owned news outlet based in Atlanta, known for covering community justice issues. She offered a statement. This wasn't about a single store. It was about a pattern that far too many of us know too well. "I came prepared not because I expected justice, but because I was done settling for less." By late afternoon, the store had issued a bland statement on its social media channels, citing a misunderstanding and emphasizing a commitment to welcoming all customers with respect and dignity. No mention of Aisha, no acknowledgement of the letter, just a vague corporate response aimed at damage control. She didn't respond publicly. Not yet. Instead, she returned to the store, not physically, but strategically. Using the store's official contact page, she submitted a formal notice. In the message, she included the legal firm's name, her attorney's contact information, and a single sentence: "Please direct any further communication through legal counsel." It was enough. She had drawn a line without needing to cross it. Yet, by the end of the day, the security guard's name had been leaked online. Someone had recognized him. The backlash was swift, though Aisha made no comment about it. She wasn't there for revenge. She wasn't trying to ruin a man's life. What she wanted was acknowledgement, accountability, and most of all, reform. As night fell again, she sat on her balcony, the quiet hum of Atlanta traffic in the background, and allowed herself a moment of stillness. She didn't feel victorious, not in a triumphant sense, but she felt firm, rooted. The video had started a conversation, but she knew that conversations weren't enough. What mattered now was what followed, how the store would respond beyond empty apologies. how the community would hold space for stories like hers without demanding proof, and how the systems enabling these moments would be challenged piece by piece. Inside, her phone buzzed again. This time, it was a voicemail from the store's regional manager requesting a conversation. Aisha deleted it without listening to the end. She had already said what she needed to say. Now, she would wait and see if anyone else had the courage to listen. The following morning dawned without fanfare. The skies over Atlanta were a muted gray, thick with late summer humidity. Aisha rose before the alarm, her body still as her mind rehearsed what the day might bring. The events at the store weren't behind her. They had simply evolved into the next stage. She showered, dressed in a pressed navy jumpsuit, and gathered her materials into a sleek black satchel before sitting at the kitchen table with a steaming mug of coffee she barely tasted. The envelope, or rather what it symbolized, had already left its mark. Now, the ripples were circling wider. By 9 o'clock, she was seated across from her legal contact at the firm, a sharp-minded woman named Elise Tran, whose reputation in civil rights litigation had made her a quiet but potent force in Atlanta's legal community. They met in a sunlit corner of the firm's midtown office. Elise had already reviewed the footage multiple times and had printed a preliminary outline of possible actions. "There's more traction than I expected," she said, her tone matter-of-fact. "The video is being shared through activist channels, and some local politicians have reposted it with commentary. It's beginning to grow legs." Aisha nodded but kept her posture neutral. "I didn't post it for traction." "I know," Elise said, "but traction has value. It can shift leverage. And right now you have plenty." The envelope itself had not just contained a letter. It had been a legal strategy. A meticulously crafted document laying out Aisha's previous cases, a clear timeline of the incident, and a formal notice that she reserved the right to pursue further action. It referenced 2 prior legal victories, both settled before trial, involving discriminatory treatment in commercial spaces. The language was polite but unequivocal. Its opening paragraph was the real fulcrum. This correspondence serves both as a record of observed discriminatory behavior and a preemptive notice of formal legal review should the pattern remain unaddressed. Elise laid a new document on the table. "They want a meeting." "Of course they do," Aisha said quietly. "Their legal team reached out this morning. They're proposing a closed-door discussion with regional leadership. No media, no recordings. Just you, me, and them." Aisha leaned back, considering. "And what do they want out of it?" "A resolution that avoids litigation and doesn't involve a public admission of fault. In other words, they want to protect the brand. Their store's reputation is now tied to a discrimination narrative that's gaining visibility." Aisha was silent for a moment. She wasn't surprised. She had spent years in classrooms teaching history, literature, and the intricacies of social narratives. She knew how corporations operated when their image was threatened. Accountability was only offered when the alternative cost more. "I'll go," she said, "but only if we set the terms. I'm not walking into a room where they pretend this was a training issue or some isolated misunderstanding." Elise smiled slightly. "I didn't think you would." The meeting was set for the next morning, and Aisha spent the rest of her day preparing, not to argue, but to remain unshakable. She didn't rehearse what to say. Instead, she immersed herself in quiet. She reread old letters she had written after previous incidents, notes she had jotted down in the margins of books during sleepless nights, fragments of truth she had carried with her from one confrontation to the next. She wasn't driven by revenge, but by precision. She needed the room to feel the depth of what had happened, not just the surface details, but the emotional architecture beneath them. The next morning, the conference room was exactly what she expected. Clean, impersonal, designed to diffuse emotion. A long mahogany table, neutral carpeting, framed photos of smiling employees lining the walls. The regional manager, a man named Gregson with carefully rehearsed warmth, greeted them first, followed by the store's legal representative and a community liaison whose name Aisha didn't catch. "Thank you for coming, Ms. Coleman," Gregson said, gesturing to the chair across from him. "I'm here because you should have come to me," she replied. The room quieted. Elise opened her folder and placed a copy of the letter on the table. The other side had already seen it, but its presence served as a reminder. This wasn't a conversation. This was an accounting. Gregson cleared his throat. We'd like to start by saying that we deeply regret any discomfort you experienced. Our team values inclusivity and... No, Aisha said firmly. You don't get to begin with a blanket apology. Not until we name what this was. The community liaison leaned forward. We understand that you felt profiled. I was profiled, she said, her voice still calm. It's not a feeling. It's a fact documented in real time. Your employee followed me through that store for 15 minutes without cause. Your manager stood by and watched. And your internal culture allowed both of them to assume it was normal. Elise remained silent beside her, letting Aisha lead. That had always been the plan. The legal representative across the table shifted slightly. Ms. Coleman, would you be open to discussing a private settlement to resolve this matter without further public scrutiny? Aisha met his eyes. That depends. On what? On what you're willing to change. A few moments passed. Gregson opened a folder of his own and slid across a printed document. It outlined a potential agreement, non-disclosure terms, a financial offer, and a vague commitment to diversity retraining. Aisha read it slowly, then slid it back. This reads like a cleanup plan. I'm offering you something better. The room waited. I don't need a payout, she continued. I need systemic changes. I want written confirmation that your company will begin a third-party audit of your security policies. I want a public commitment to anti-bias training, not internal memos. I want your employees to understand that suspicion is not a default lens through which you view black customers. The liaison opened her mouth, then closed it again. You want this to go away, Aisha added. It won't, but it can evolve. You get to choose whether that evolution begins with accountability or with silence. Gregson leaned back, visibly uncomfortable but aware they had misjudged her. She wasn't a disgruntled customer. She was a force with purpose. We'll review your requests, he said finally. You'll do more than review, Elise added, speaking for first time. You'll respond within 48 hours. Otherwise, we proceed publicly. No one challenged her. The meeting ended without handshakes. As Aisha and Elise exited into the sunlight, the city seemed unchanged, cars moving, pedestrians passing, but something in the air felt different. Not lighter, just more aligned. The conversation inside that sterile conference room hadn't fixed anything, but it had clarified the stakes. And that, for Aisha, was a start. When the 48-hour deadline passed with no substantive response, Aisha felt neither surprise nor frustration, only a grim satisfaction. She had anticipated this delay. It was part of the choreography she had constructed. While the store's legal team might have expected that evasion would weaken her, she had judged correctly. Inaction only amplified the pressure. Immediately afterward, Aisha and her attorney issued a brief, pointed public statement. We await clarity. Until then, we stand ready. No posturing, just a quiet firmness that resonated far beyond the walls of any meeting room. The response came 3 hours later, better than nothing. A formal letter arrived from the company's lawyers. They expressed sincere regret and promised measurable changes. It was vague, but it was a start. It included an offer to fund an independent audit and to hire a third-party consultant to develop a bias awareness training program. There was no mention of financial compensation. Instead, they suggested a meeting to craft a collaborative path forward. Aisha and Elise pored over the document together. It wasn't everything she had asked, but it wasn't silence either. The echo of acknowledgement mattered. Within hours, the local black-owned news outlet that had first interviewed her published an editorial amplifying her story. They described her not as a victim, but as an agent of accountability. Online, comments poured in from people who said they felt seen for the first time. Others reached out to share their own stories of silent surveillance in everyday places. Aisha monitored the response, not to bask in affirmation, but to check that the narrative remained focused on institutional change, not personal triumph. Simultaneously, the store quietly began implementing changes. At first, it was small. The security staff received memos about bias training. Some managers received sensitivity guidelines. But these were still internal memos, the kind tucked away in binder jackets and never read aloud. Aisha watched from a distance, knowing that words on a page were not enough. But change, even incremental, was better than none. Then, unexpectedly, a representative from a local civil rights museum reached out. They were curating an exhibit on everyday resistance, stories of individuals confronting systems of bias in supermarkets, bus stops, laundromats. Aisha's footage and documentation were offered a place in the exhibit. It felt surreal. The museum's curator described her approach as quietly seismic, a punctuation mark in a long, ongoing narrative of civil equity. Aisha felt a lump in her throat reading the email. It wasn't about recognition. It was about legacy. Despite that, she declined. Not because she didn't value the invitation, but because her story was still unfolding. It wasn't done being lived. She didn't want static display. She wanted dynamic transformation. She responded, "I appreciate the honor, but this isn't retrospective. Walk with me now." And then she suggested a community event at the store, a public dialogue accompanied by local social justice leaders, educators, store representatives, consumers, an honest forum. Her vision was clear. This moment should serve as both a reckoning and a teaching tool. The museum agreed to defer. The store, faced with the possibility of a community gathering spotlighting its policies, quietly accepted with caveats. Their marketing team drafted announcements about open dialogue and community partnerships, promising refreshments and moderated conversation. Aisha insisted any such event be framed not as a PR ploy, but as a sincere opening. The details were negotiated slowly, carefully, through a lease and the firm's oversight. Meanwhile, a broader coalition of educators, activists, and legal advocates began coalescing around her story. A local teachers' union asked if Aisha would speak about it in an upcoming panel on systemic bias. She agreed, but only if the focus remained on preventative strategies, not sensationalism. She delivered her talk with clear-eyed resolve. How to carry presence in your personhood without apology. How to use tools, letter, video, legal precedent, as shields and levers, not weapons. Her words transcended personal narrative. They became a blueprint. On the evening of the dialogue at the store, the fluorescent lights felt different. Tables lined the front entrance. Community members mingling as the store prepared for what felt like a town hall. Aisha walked in alongside Elise and the community liaison, their arrival muted yet profound. Inside, some staff looked uncertain. Others smiled, scanning the crowd with relief. The regional manager, still there, approached her with hesitant hope. "I'm glad you came," he said, voice low. Aisha nodded. "I'm here for the work." The dialogue began simply. A community organizer moderated. Aisha spoke first, recounting how something as seemingly banal as grocery shopping can become battleground for dignity. She was measured, compelling, unflinching. Then store representatives spoke. Their words were earnest, perhaps nervous, but genuine. They discussed the audit findings that had already begun. Staff biases, policies that advise erring on neutrality as a guise for safety, training gaps in recognizing customer intent beyond appearance. Then the floor opened. A black teenager spoke about being followed in a boutique. A faith leader described how churches had become places of refuge in part because shops felt unsafe. An elderly couple described noticing Aisha's calm dignity on TikTok after midnight when the video had infected timelines nationwide. There was pain, yes, but also repair. The store pledged to establish a standing advisory board that included community members. They committed to biannual public updates on training progress and auditing results. Staff would participate in scenario-based workshops designed not just to avoid bias, but to practice equity. No more silent assumptions, not because fear compelled it, but because responsibility did. Aisha left early, choosing to slip away before applause. The conversation would continue. The work would continue. Her phone stayed in her sponsor until she reached home. She knew this wasn't a finale. It was a hinge, a way forward that others could emulate. She set the video's privacy to restricted, keeping accessible only to students and legal colleagues, honoring its utility, not its spectacle. At bedtime, she listened to the hum of Atlanta beyond her window. She didn't feel triumphant. she felt resolute. Her groceries were long unpacked. Her dinner had been delayed, then cold, then reheated. It didn't matter. There was something more nourishing now. Communities acknowledging hidden fractures, institutions making gestures toward repair, and a quiet insistence that dignity isn't given, it's compelled. She closed her eyes, thinking of the envelope she hadn't opened that night, of the readings still waiting on her desk, of the narratives she would teach her students. Tomorrow, she would return to her classroom, where questions bubbled and young minds were waiting. She would teach them what she had practiced in that store, that being seen, truly seen, begins when you decide to stand with clarity, and that sometimes the ripples you create are all you need to turn the tide. With that, her night settled into peace. The moment had ended, but the story, her story, was still in motion.